Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for day 3 of Wheat Week with the Soil Health Partnership. My name is Anna Teeter, and I'm the Minnesota Field Manager. Again, this is day 3 of Wheat Week, where we'll be talking with wheat Minnesota growers as well as a local wheat expert. To bring you the best experience today, we ask that you turn off any other programs on your computer as well as any other web browsers that you have running. This will optimize your viewing experience and not compete with any bandwidth that you might need. Also, you may need to adjust your volume from time to time since this was shot in the field, and so the volume is not 100% perfect. The Soil Health Partnership, or SHP, is a farmer-led and farmer-focused nonprofit research group that is the initiative of the National Corn Growers Association with the support of more than 100 organizations. We have over 200 research sites in 16 states, and we help growers implement management practices and collect data to evaluate those practices that are important on their farm. We're working in collaboration with the General Mills, the National Wheat Foundation, and our state wheat organizations to help wheat's high potential to integrate conservation practices. With these partnerships, the Soil Health Partnership is able to apply its expertise and focus on wheat's unique role in soil health. I'd like to remind you to stay tuned for a live Q&A with the growers at the end of today's event. And before we begin, if you have any questions that you would like answered, you can type them in the chat or the question and answer box down below, and we will ask them to our farmer panelists at the end of today's event. Now I'd just like to go over our agenda real quick. You'll be meeting Glenn Hjelle. Then I'll be introducing Missy Carlson from the Minnesota Wheat and Research and Promotion Council. We'll be talking with the growers from Trinity Creek Ranch, and then we'll have our SHP Farmer Panel. Okay, so for our first farm visit, we'll be traveling to West Central Minnesota to talk with Glenn Hjelle, who is interested in comparing tillage practices for his SHP trial. Glenn has only recently joined our program, so you'll get to experience Glenn in implementing these practices for the first time on his farm.
I'm Glenn Hjelle. I've been farming since the early 80s with my father and mother. We grow corn, wheat, soybeans currently. Used to be just a wheat and soybean rotation. We've been experimenting with cover crops the last 8 years. Back in the 80s, we started experimenting with no-till. Worked well for about 8 years, but then the weather turned wet, and now recently we've been going back to it because of the soil health benefits, and it's been good.
So at SHP, we have 2 different trial types. We have strip trials and side-by-side trials. Our strip trials are 8 trial strips replicated and randomized throughout the field. This is our more detailed and more intense study trial setup. We use this with growers who are really interested in looking at their soil health benefits and watching progress over time. And this strip trial setup is also contracted over 5 years. And so this helps us see a long-term change in the soil. And now granted, we would love to have these trials for 20 years. 5 years is still better than 1 or 2. And so in the comparison, you have your side-by-side trials, and the side-by-side trials are generally looking at extreme changes in management from one side to the other. They are less detailed, we take less soil samples, but they're easier for farmers to implement, and we don't do them for as long, but the ultimate impact is the economic changes in the system change across the farm. And so that's kind of the two different views. We have our more soil science and science view and our more economic view. And both collect the same kind of information, but at different scales. So Glenn, could you tell me a little bit about how you got started in doing no-till and conservation practices on your farm?
Years ago, my father got a Concord air seeder, and we decided to had some falls where we didn't have moisture, so we decided to do some no-tilling, and it worked. So we continued doing it until it got really wet. Then we went back to conventional, and now I'm finding out the soil health benefits of being able to get across the fields by doing the minimum tillage, vertical tillage, and the water infiltration. And the study we're about to do is going to prove what I know already, I think, so hopefully.
Hopefully. Yeah, so can you tell me about what led you to doing our SHP study before we get into the design of it, like the circumstances last fall that led up to it?
Missy, Minnesota wheat. We've been doing a plot on XSSP and K, and she suggested that, hey, being you're doing cover crops in the vertical tillage, got me a hold of you.
Yeah.
So we can set up a plot and see how it works.
Yeah. And what is your experience with cover crops then, since you're a wheat grower?
About supposed to be 8 years ago, I started doing some cover crops because I was in the CSP program where they paid you to do it. So I used to rent the equipment, have the fertilizer company come out, and I'd rent a Salford. And I started seeing benefits after 4 years where the fields were firmer. There wasn't the ponding after rain, so then I bought my rig over there and started doing it myself.
Okay. And what did they start you out with cover crops?
Just been a radish and turnip mix.
Okay.
Main reason I don't throw in a grass is I like to turn the wind up on my combine to throw out all the little kernels, so I get a nice mat of wheat out there besides.
Yeah, okay. And so have you been using radish and turnips this whole time?
Yes.
Okay.
This is my Salford 4200 that I bought to do my vertical tillage. This one has curved blades in the front to throw more dirt, which I can set lower, bring corn stalks to chop them up. And when I'm doing my cover crops, I tip it back so just the waffly blades work the soil so I don't get as much dirt thrown. I have a Valmar applicator on here to put my radish and turnip mixes down. Been doing some experimenting. I moved the boom to the back because after talking with other growers, using the drag and rolling baskets works better for putting the cover crop in, because I used to have it in front and it got too deep, so only about half of the crop come up. So this is my baby. I really enjoy it. It saved me a lot of time. Usually try and hit the fields just once in the fall, once in the spring, so it saves a lot of fuel and time.
And what motivated you to put the seeder on your rig here?
Because only putting on 6-7 pounds of seed, you have to have a precision box on your fertilizer spreader, and you still have to mix fertilizer with it. If I don't need the fertilizer, then I'm over fertilizing, this way I can save fertilizer and application costs and do it more timely.
And so today we're going to be talking about our SHP plot here that we're putting in this field. As you can see, we have wheat stubble, so this will be a wheat-soy rotation, and what we're doing is we're going to be comparing a chisel plow versus a vertical tillage implementation across the field. And so we'll have chisel plow, which is the more aggressive tillage, in comparison with the vertical tillage in the fall, and then we'll be applying a cover crop over the entire thing. And then in the spring, we'll be coming back through with the vertical tillage.
With the vertical tillage,
yep.
Depending on the spring. If it's
right.
a dry spring, I might no-till right into the cover crop.
And that would be the ideal scenario.
Ideal scenario, that's why we're trying to do this.
Yeah. So hopefully this will be the first fall that we implement these treatments here. And so we have all of our flags set up, and it'll be all rolling and ready to go in the next couple of days here. And I'm hoping that in the future you'll get updates and see how things progress. This core was taken from the bottom of a hill, and this core was taken from the top of a hill. And even though you see quite a bit of a horizon here with lots of dark soil, you can see the stuff at the bottom of the hill is significantly darker. And so that a lot of this has come from the tops of the hills. And so even though it may not look like you're losing a lot of soil, you are eroding soil when you're tilling and it rains, and all of these forces bring the soil down the hill. And so you can see that at the top of the hill we're starting to hit our B horizon here in our clay layers. But I mean, even if you just compare the difference in the color, right, you can see quite a bit of difference. Even the stuff at the top of the stuff from the top of the hill is still lighter than the stuff from the bottom of the hill.
This is my conventional tillage machine. John Deere chisel plow with 4-inch twists on it. Really moves a lot of dirt. Not really good for soil structure, but
Or any soil health?
For any soil health, that's why I don't use it much anymore. I do have it set up where I can put points on and deband fertilizer to get more efficiency out of my fertilizer, especially the P and K. Works pretty good. Just don't use it much anymore. It's like say once you got the vertical tillage, it does a much better job of saving the structure of the soil.
Have you noticed a big difference in germination between using this machine and using your vertical till?
Not so much in germination, but for planter depth control.
Okay.
The ground is much more even with vertical tillage.
Okay.
With the chisel plow, like I say, you destroy the structure so much, like in the low ground, you sink.
Yeah.
On the hilltops, you bring up the clay, which is hard, and then you can't get the seed into the ground.
Okay. And then when you have the seed slot open, is it easier to close then, or?
Yes, because it's not so cloddy. It's got the small aggregates that are easier to move and control.
One of the advantages of a virtual field day is being able to show the progression of time in a video. Here's an overhead shot of the field before Glenn implemented his chisel plow and vertical till treatments. Thankfully, we'll be able to show you footage of the actual equipment working in our SHP plot. In the first video, we have Glenn using his chisel plow, which is a more aggressive form of tillage. While in comparison, here's the vertical tillage, which is much less aggressive and is how Glenn gets a great established cover crop after wheat. As you can see, after some timely rainfall in about 10 days, the cover crop is growing quite aggressively.
All right. Thanks, Glenn, for letting us stop by your farm and see what you have to offer. Next, we're going to be interviewing Missy Carlson, who is the VP of Research with the Minnesota Wheat Research and Promotion Council on-farm network. They implement on-farm replicated strip trials for spring wheat and soybean research covering from Baudette, Minnesota to Elbow Lake, Minnesota. Welcome, Missy.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
Can you just give me an update of the 2020 growing season, talk about the weather and the disease pressure that you've seen in the Red River Valley in west central Minnesota?
Yeah, so mostly I work for the Minnesota Wheat Research and Promotion Council, and as Anna said, and we have an on-farm research network. So like she said, we conduct replicated strip trials mostly throughout northwestern Minnesota, but we do extend all the way up from Baudette, up near Lake of the Woods, all the way down to Glenn Hjelle's farm down in Elbow Lake. But mostly my base of operation is kind of that northwestern corner of Minnesota. Our 2020 season, I would say, it's much better than last year. We did have a kind of a late spring, late to get in. At least we got things going in kind of in May and later in the May, so it's a little bit later than we like to get the wheat in. And then also during June, we had a pretty wet June, so spray season was also difficult, not just for wheat, but for all the crops up here, especially up in the very northwestern corner of Minnesota, kind of in the Hallock, Kennedy area, if people know where that is. They were extremely wet this year. And so they've actually had some difficulty combining with trafficability and trying to get across the field, getting their wheat off up there. So it's been some little wet, but drier than last year, and just kind of depends on the region and where you're at, where you got the rainstorms. So that's kind of what our weather was like this year. Disease pressure, I would say the scab pressure was not as bad as last year. And it was wet, so we did have some disease pressure. But I'd say the scab actually wasn't, the fusarium head blight wasn't as bad as it was last year. Mostly I saw, the fields that I was in anyway, just some tan spot, which is usually pretty normal to have tan spot in wheat. This year, one pest that we did have to contend with was armyworm. A lot of fields had armyworms, just at varying levels. So growers had to just kind of keep an eye out on their wheat fields just to make sure that they didn't cross that threshold and need to spray insecticides.
Right. Yeah. And being that you're not dryland wheat, I think that that's a challenge, especially coming from our conversation yesterday with Kansas growers. So can you tell me some of the challenges that wheat producers in your area face because you're not in a dryland wheat situation?
I'd say we are dryland wheat, but we're wetter than Kansas.
Yes.
I would say that. Some challenges, kind of like what I had mentioned before, some challenges that growers have, just kind of trying to get in on time in kind of towards the end of April can be difficult, especially the last couple of years. We've had late springs that just haven't thawed out very quickly and then have been really wet. So we've had been getting a lot of rain in the fall, which carries over into the spring. So then we start off in a wet spring. And so just waiting for the fields to dry out after they get thawed out has been difficult. So getting in on time can sometimes be a challenge depending on the year. And then lately, the last couple of years, a challenge that's popped up, especially for growers without grain dryers, has been getting the wheat off. Getting the wheat off on time. It's been just kind of it's been raining a little bit earlier in the season than it usually does, and so it's been interfering a little bit with wheat harvest. And so for growers that don't have dryers, they have to wait until the wheat dries down before they can take the grain off. And for those who don't have dryers, it's been a little bit more difficult just because the wheat hasn't been drying down, or if the wheat hasn't dried down. This year we did notice that it just seemed to take a long time for the wheat to ripen and get dry. So it delayed harvest a couple weeks later than it normally is.
Sure. And those challenges are always hard to deal with, but maybe we can talk about some of the benefits that wheat brings to their operation, and what advantages that brings and how that impacts farm diversity.
Yeah, for sure. We can have a lot of different benefits. Just when you look at, especially when you look at a systems approach to kind of your whole operation. So up here in the Red River Valley, we also grow a lot of sugar beets. And so a lot of the sugar beet growers like to include wheat in their rotation, just to extend the rotation, because including wheat can help break up your disease cycles, especially so if you're just growing corn and soybeans. And if you happen to be building up a lot of disease pressure, if you're getting a lot of herbicide resistant weeds, wheat is a great tool to use to kind of break up those cycles for both diseases and weeds. So you can use different classes of herbicides to hopefully try and get on top of controlling maybe some herbicide resistance that's been popping up in fields. I know that's becoming a much larger problem in southern Minnesota. With herbicide resistant water hemp is becoming a huge problem, has been a huge problem in southern Minnesota, and is a growing problem up here in northern Minnesota. And so wheat can be a great tool for managing weed resistance. And like I said before, I'm trying to break up disease cycles for other different crops, and just adding a little bit more diversity in rotation. Not just diversifying, what's growing and helping increase the diversity in your soil and health, and your soil health, but also increasing your diversity in assets too. Just from an economic standpoint, it's usually not a bad idea to try and diversify commodities that you have.
Absolutely. And then you can also look at the timing that growers have now that they have crops that require different harvest periods and planting periods and spraying. And so you get to extend and shorten your season to be more flexible in that way.
Yes, you reminded me. That is another great benefit that I failed to mention was, yes, and spreading your workload out over the season a little bit longer. So wheat up here usually is typically harvested in August into the beginning of September. And so after you get that wheat off the ground, ideally in a normal year, whatever you could consider a normal year, there's some time in between wheat harvest and the next crop, which is usually soybeans. So you've got time to do ditching or maybe work some fields if you need to, or take care of some other stuff and not have, you know, if you just got corn and soybeans, everything all needs to get done at once. So spreading out your workload over a little longer period in the fall is definitely a benefit also.
Absolutely. And for growers who aren't growing sugar beets, can you talk to me about the ideal wheat rotation? Because I know a lot of people kind of struggle in knowing where to put wheat in their rotation.
I don't know. I guess maybe I wouldn't say, I don't know if I would say if there's any like ideal rotation. I guess everybody's going to have their own rotation that works well. A lot of folks up here, kind of outside of the valley, the wheat soybean rotation, kind of like what Glenn said he had started with. That's very popular for folks who are just growing wheat and soybeans, having that grass and that broadleaf in rotation. So that works well. And then, as Glenn said, he also started growing corn. And so if you're going to throw wheat into a corn soybean rotation, you would want to do it prior to corn. So you would want to do soybeans, wheat, and then corn. Because corn is also a host for fusarium head blight, which is wheat scab. And so if you grow corn and then follow it with wheat, the scab or the fusarium head blight that's overwintering on that corn stubble is really going to cause a lot of disease problems in your wheat. So if you are going to include it in a wheat corn soybean rotation, or just make sure you put it ahead of corn rather than behind corn.
Absolutely. And I guess my last question for you is to talk about how we incorporate cover crops into these crop rotations, because a lot of wheat growers don't want to use rye, but some wheat growers do use rye. You know, what are some of the ways that growers can incorporate cover crops that can make them successful, and maybe talk about some of the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, for sure. Getting to the point of why we're all here on this webinar today. Back to talking about cover crops. Wheat is also really helpful. So going back to that notion of spreading out your workload, it also gives you a little bit more time to get some cover crops established. So up here in northern Minnesota, the fall comes quickly. And so we have a very short growing period. And so harvesting the wheat off earlier and getting cover crops established after wheat is very helpful for us to get at least some growth of the cover crops before we get the first killing frosts later on, usually October. If we're really lucky, maybe November. But actually, the last couple of days we've gotten a couple frosts, so it's coming fast. So that's a benefit that we have using wheat, is getting those cover crops established. So I don't know if any of the viewers have ever listened to Abby Wick. She's the soil health extension person at NDSU, and she is a cover crop guru, I would say. She recommends a couple different things. I know for cover growers getting started in cover crops up here, she would even say just practice managing with your volunteer wheat, letting the volunteer wheat grow up after harvest, and just practicing managing with that residue and using that as your first cover, and just using that as basically a free cover crop. Other things that growers have been using up here are maybe turnips or radishes. Radishes have been really popular. Sometimes you can spread or put out oats or barley afterwards too if you want to get something extra. But those crops will all winter kill, so you'll get a little bit of growth in the fall. Hopefully, if you can get a little bit more growth or enough growth to make do something to make a difference. But those you won't have to worry about terminating in the spring. Whereas cereal rye, which is a really great cover crop to use up here because it's so cold tolerant. So the cereal rye will keep on growing even as we get down in the 40s and upper 30s, and the cereal rye won't die off until you get those really, really hard frosts where it's like 28 for a few hours during the night. And then the cereal rye will overwinter and come back in the spring, which is something we struggle with up here in northern Minnesota. We're so cold, not a lot overwinters. And so cereal rye is one of those that we can use to come back in the spring, which is beneficial can be beneficial for water management. So if we get the cereal rye growing in the spring, it can use up some of the moisture we get, the extra moisture we have just from snow melt, spring moisture, to hopefully get into the field a little bit sooner. But also staying on top of it and making sure that's not using up too much moisture. So that will have to get terminated in the spring.
Absolutely.
So those are a couple different cover crop options that folks have been trying up here. And I know when we have the farmer Q&A session, I know Glenn and Michaela and David, I'm sure they will be able to answer lots of questions of different things they've been trying. Michaela and David, they actually don't live too far away from where I work here at the weed office in Red Lake Falls. So kind of right in the same neighborhood.
Thank you so much, Missy, for taking the chance to go live with us today. I really, really appreciate it. Next, we'll be traveling to Northwest Minnesota in the Red River Valley to talk with Trinity Creek Ranch. With such a short growing season, they have to get creative with how they approach soil health on their farm. So next we will see their video. And again, thank you, Missy, for your time.
Welcome to Trinity Creek Ranch. My name is Michaela Tabbert.
And I'm Benjamin Tabbert.
And I'm David Miller. This farm was begun in 1952 by my father. Purchased it, moved in from North Dakota. And my wife and I, Peggy, took over in 1989, and Benjamin and Michaela joined the operation in 2016. We are a very diversified farm. We raise cattle, but we also have several crops: corn, wheat, soybeans, fescue, field peas, cereal rye, canola, alfalfa. So we grow a lot of crops, plus a lot of cover crops.
A lot of what we like to do is integrate the crop and the livestock part. So you'll see as we go through some of our crops, we're really trying to integrate cover crops into that and be able to run our livestock on the land, just to kind of decrease the amount of manure hauling we have to do, help the fertility, and just to kind of to get that cash flow from doing a cover crop, because it's a long-term game with cover crops. So we like to try to recoup that expense in the first year with our grazing.
When we took over the operation in 1989, we saw there were some erosion problems on the farm. We were using mulch tillage, chisel plow, elevator. So we started thinking we should maybe try no-till. So we bought a no-till drill in 1994 and also added strip till in 1995. So that kind of began our journey towards reduced tillage. And one of our main goals was to increase the soil organic matter. So something I learned in college is very important. I've since learned that's not really the only important characteristic of soil, of course, but that was our goal. And no-till was a start in that direction, but it really didn't get us where we needed to be. So then we started looking at cover crops as being an option. So in 2012, we had a program from the state of Minnesota which helped us to plant a cover crop because it was a very dry year that year. And it kind of was an eye-opener. We planted a multi-species cover crop that did really well. We got a little rain after it, and we got a lot of tonnage off it, a lot of nice growth, and cattle were able to graze on it. And we saw it was kind of an eye-opening experience. And then on the next following spring, we really saw a difference in the soil tilth. It was very nice to plant into, so that was another eye-opening experience. So from then on, we've pretty much been following our small grains crops with cover crop, and then we also started integrating more cover crops into the crops by interseeding and even doing full season cover crops for grazing.
We started with doing the equip contract, and that specific contract was 5 years of cover crop on that field every year. Well, after wheat was really easy for us to do a cover crop, but something like corn and soybeans, where we get it off basically as the snow is falling, it was really hard to get something established. So we were having things flown on, and that could work, but more often it didn't work very well, or you'd get very little establishment. So that's kind of what pushed us into trying the interseeding, and we've kind of been experimenting with that for 3 years. They just built a shop-built interseeder that kind of we're side dressing nitrogen at the same time to kind of help do that, because we just don't have the season here to establish a cover crop after harvest of more of the row crops.
So we're standing here in our SHP trial, and Trinity Creek Ranch is looking at comparing cover crop versus no cover crop in all years of their rotation. So in the soybean years, as they talked about, we'll be interseeding the cover crop in a pollinator mix, and then in the corn years, they'll be interseeding around V4. and then they'll be seeding cover crop after wheat harvest in wheat years. And so they're trying to really get the best bang for their buck and get cover crops in at every point during their crop rotation so that they can see the biggest benefit.
We've only been renting, I think, 3 years now, and it's been the Soil Health Partnership going on 2. We chose this field because it kind of needs help. It's not a great field. It's a little heavier across. It's heavier soil. It's not really heavy soil. It's still sandy loam, but it's not drained great. It doesn't have a lot of soil structure. The tilth is not very good. So this is a field we want to improve. So we didn't choose our other fields at home that have been no-till and cover crops for longer because we've seen improvement. This field needs help, so this is one of the reasons we chose this field.
So here we have 2 different soil cores that we've taken. This one here is from the SHP trial site that they've only been working on for 3 years, and so they've only just started doing reduced tillage and no tillage on that field. Prior to that, it was conventionally tilled field. This core here is from their home farm that they've had and been no-tilling since 1994. And you can see that there's quite a bit of difference even though they're both sandy loams. This one is significantly darker and also much stronger aggregates in comparison to the newer field. You can see how they break apart differently. And so we want to turn the SHP field here into what this field is.
So we started kind of getting involved in the Soil Health Partnership after being approached by Minnesota Wheat, kind of asking us, they want to be able to incentivize doing what we're doing and wanting the data. And we believe that cover crops definitely build your soil health and your biology and helps profitability. But we wanted the data to back that. So that's kind of what pushed us into agreeing with it. We really like the Soil Health Partnership doing all of this soil testing, and it's a more intensive look at things, and they were going to look at profitability as well. That was something we were really interested in and seeing. And we really liked it's a 5-year program. So that's about, we think, when you really start to see some benefits, especially in regards to your soil tests and your soil organic matter and just the tilth and stuff. So that was something that we really liked about it, that we were going to be able to measure that over 5 years and see kind of what can change. And this was land that we had picked up just a year previously, I think. So it was kind of new land that had been in conventional tillage. So it was a spot that we really thought we would really be able to see some good benefits of doing cover crops. Last year was our first year for the Soil Health Partnership trial. And so that spring we took a lot of soil samples that spring, and it was corn. So we interseeded around V4, a pretty complex mix, maybe 10 different species or so. And we actually got really good establishment. It was a really good catch. It was a really good year for that. Maybe a little on the dry side for us. We weren't as wet as the rest of Minnesota. But we had pretty good establishment. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we didn't get to do any soil sampling this year. But this is the 2nd year now, and we have soybeans. And soybeans is by far the hardest crop for us to really get a good cover crop established in. It's canopy's too much, and we've had things flowing on, and that works okay, but it gets about yay tall, and you clip it off, and it's gone. And our rotation has went to wheat, so that takes cereal rye out of that equation. So that kind of limits us too. So something we tried this year, since we knew we needed to get a cover crop in the cover crop strips, was we interseeded it maybe end of July or so, and we interseeded it with what we had kind of hoped would be flowering about the same time as the beans, and it got a little late, so it's definitely still a learning curve, but we at least have some establishment in flax. It's definitely not impressive, but it kind of gives us something to work towards in the future. There's things like buckwheat and phacelia and red clover in there as well. We did put teff grass in, but we found that actually worked. We kind of used low rates, so it wasn't a very expensive mix to use. But the hope is once the leaves start dropping that can take off some more too.
So we're looking in the row here, and we have rapeseed coming up, We have flax,
Cecilia there.
Phacelia,
Buckwheat.
buckwheat.
There was a clover somewhere around here.
There's also clover,
Tough grass.
and then some tough grass.
Over here. Safflower. There's safflower here.
Safflower.
There's clover. Yeah, so last year, after corn harvest, we were able to bring all our cattle over here, and we actually spent the whole month of December on this 128-acre field. So
That was about 150 cows.
and so because of the plot here, we made it so that the cattle would always graze a strip of the stuff that was treated with the cover crop, another strip that was not treated, so that it would keep the results similar, so it wouldn't skew one side or the other. And so hopefully we'll be able to see that at some point, if it made an impact on that or not, once we get some soil tests and stuff. But it was kind of an interesting experience because this whole piece is not next to anything else we own, really. So we had to bring water out with a truck, which was a little bit interesting, but it did seem to work. It was our first experience having cattle away from a permanent water source of any sort. So like I said, it's getting hard to get posts into the ground, and so we would typically use a masonry bit on a drill just to pop a hole in, just to break through the frost layer. So that was one of the challenges that we had to face. But by the end of the time we were out here grazing, we had probably close to 2 feet of snow that the cattle were digging down through to get to the corn stalks and whatever cover crop residue was left.
How much biomass, or what was the height and density of the cover crop that you had out here?
The cover crop was maybe about a foot tall.
Okay.
But there's a lot of value in corn as well. Yeah, probably 400 pounds would be a good guess. But so I mean, the biomass of the cover crop wasn't as important as having something that was a good protein and energy source. I mean, corn stalks can get to be pretty low in protein, and it's tougher on cows to just graze that. That was part of the reason we do more frequent moves too, as well. 'Cause they kind of go and eat all the corn and then don't have anything to eat. So we ran about 150 cows on about 125 acres for all over a month, and into the end of December. And we probably would have actually grazed them longer, and we had some more stuff we could have grazed, but we got a pretty big snowstorm, and that's asking a little bit too much of pregnant cows, we felt. But being able to extend that grazing season into December when everyone else is feeding in end of September, October is huge. That's really helps your profitability in that, because feeding a cow is not cheap. So we're actually pushing back our calving date now to May instead of March, kind of being able to push our cows a little bit further as it gets older, because they're not going to be as far, they're going to be in their second trimester instead of third. And so that's kind of adjusting how we do things. And that's one of the, you'll see our crop rotation is pretty diverse because we want to be able to graze things. So that's why we put sunflowers in, because we can seed that a little later. So we actually calved just 40 head on cereal rye this spring, and then we went and seeded sunflower after that.
So we're under the canopy of some sunflowers here. This is our second year growing them. I did grow them when I was a kid, but first time back with the whole family here. They're actually looking real good. We interseeded these when they were about 10 inches tall, and we also side dressed nitrogen just like corn, not as much nitrogen, but same type of thing. We got several species here. The goal with sunflowers is to try to get some pollinators, something that will attract beneficial insects. Last year when we did this, we seeded the sunflowers and the cover crop simultaneously, and we had tremendous growth on the cover crops, but to the point of being too competitive, I thought. This year we went about the same time as the corn, or just a little after, and kind of having the opposite effect. We have very little growth under this tremendous canopy of sunflowers. So I don't know if we're maybe gonna have to try to seed them earlier, or find a happy medium. One of the reasons we're growing sunflowers, aside from just adding diversity, is it gives us a crop that we can plant a little later. because we like to graze. We're starting to graze our cereal rye in the spring and calve on our cereal rye in the spring in late May, early June. And this gives us an opportunity to have a crop we can graze and calve on and still be able to plant a later planted crop like sunflowers that can still make maturity and produce some good income.
The idea with the cover crop, our goal, is to have kind of something flowering all the time, that by the time the sunflowers are flowering, then you'd already have your beneficial insects there and attracted. And that was kind of, it worked really well last year, but like he said, maybe we had too much cover crop growth. So we have got to play with our timing a little bit more, because right now none of the cover crop has even flowered at all yet.
We got some buckwheat.
One buckwheat is flowered. so we're not to where we want to be yet, but regardless, we'll maybe, like, another goal of that would be to have a decent cover crop established under the sunflowers, that after sunflower harvest we maybe would have something to graze for the cattle. I mean, they can clean up some of the down heads and stuff, but that would be another way to cash flow that cover crop as well. So we're kind of looking at it from both sides, but we definitely have some tweaking to do with that.
Well, on the plus side, this is a much better looking crop of sunflowers than we had last year. So there's a happy medium in there, we hope.
So kind of what we've put in this mix, we've got a fair amount of flax. Lentil, that's what that is, yep.
Clover,
Clovers.
buckwheat. We saw some Facillia earlier. We got some cowpea right here in front of us.
Faba bean is in the mix.
And also the hope is that once the sunflowers dry down and these leaves start shriveling up and dropping, that there'll be a lot more light getting into the canopy and we'll get a lot more growth a little later in the fall. But it isn't being competitive with the crop at all right now.
I think we did also put in some grasses kind of for grazing alone, that hopefully they'll come stronger once the sunflowers die down too. We tried to have a pretty diverse mix. Some legumes in there, some grasses, some broadleaves, and then some from the brassica family as well. Just trying to have a pretty diverse mix, just for the diversity of microorganisms.
So we're standing in a cornfield. It's actually the first year we've farmed this particular field. It's interseeded with a wide variety of species, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we interseed about V4 to V5, and we also can side dress our 28%. So this field had 28% nitrogen side dress at the same time we seeded. It's a new machine we built this year for that purpose. It's working pretty well. This probably ended up being one of our better stands for this year. It's been a little tougher year to get a stand of cover crop. I think part of the reason is we lost a lot of our cover last year. We didn't get a good establishment of rye to seed into. Plus it's been wet on and off. The soil at the surface is very wet. So when the opener tries to split that soil, instead of enclosing ice behind it, it just kind of throws it out. So it got to be really difficult to get a good cover on our cover crop. But for whatever reason, this field I think was maybe the residue was a little better and a little better soil contact. We got a pretty established cover crop in this particular field. We've done this now, I think, going on 3 years, and the first year we did it about V5. Last year got a little behind us and closer to 6 or even later. So this year we went a little earlier on V4. So we're kind of trying to find that happy ground. We did find last year that later planting, later seeding at V6 or later is just too late. You don't get any real establishment of the cover crop before you get the canopy. So it's pretty important to get the cover crop off to a good start, and V4 seems to be a good place to do that.
One of the reasons that we do the interseeding, we really like to have diversity. We're kind of trying to promote plant diversity for microbial diversity, trying to get that whole system a jump start. Another reason is we might not graze this field because it's a ways away, but we like to have some extra forage to help supplement the corn. We like to graze our corn stalks, and there's some species that can handle shade better than others. And we like to have a pretty diverse mix. When we started, it was maybe 3-4 species, and now we're probably more 10 to 12, but we're not doing high rates of all those. It's kind of low rates. And we're doing that, I mean, everything is in there because of certain reasons. For example, like flax is really good for mycorrhizal fungi. Buckwheat is really good for beneficial insects. We have a lot of brassicas in there. That's really great for grazing. things like faba beans, clover, that's for grazing, and also nitrogen fixation. So we kind of have a reason each thing is in there, but we like to have a diverse thing because we've seen in different soils or just different years, one year things will do really well and the next year they don't show up as well. So we kind of have a little bit of a fail-safe having a complex mix. Other things that we have in this mix is cereal rye, so we have something that overwinters. It doesn't establish as well and it doesn't overwinter as well in corn, but we do still see it the next spring. Not quite as robust as other cereal rye. We also have cowpea that really handles the heat really well and the shade really well, and that does really well. We would put a lot more in, but it is expensive, so that's why we don't put much more than a couple pounds. Can you think of any other species that are using? We tried some chicory as well this year, which is expensive, so it's a low rate. Yep, we have a little bit of annual ryegrass. That really comes back really robust like after the leaf drop. It really is some nice grazing, so we have done that.
It seems that annual ryegrass is used more extensively further south.
Yeah.
Where cereal rye tends to do a little better up here, but we found that when you graze, the annual ryegrass does not seem to take the fall grazing as well as cereal rye will. This year is the first year I think we've had them both in. We've gone one or the other, and this year we've got them both, so it'll be interesting to see how that works out. One of the big challenges to interseeding and really any cover crop program is herbicides. What you can use, what has a carryover that might hurt your cover crop, or what has a residual that might hurt your livestock. And you look at the list of chemicals and you follow what the residual is or what the grazing restriction is, and the list gets extremely long. So our program is pretty simple as far as herbicides go. We like to have something growing when we come in here. So hopefully we get a cereal rye coming in, or coming off a weed, so we've had cereal rye planted the previous fall. Starting last fall, we did actually a biostrip, so we're doing 2 rows of rye and 2 rows of biostrip. So we can come in and we can plant where that biostrip was in the next spring. We've got the living cereal rye in between. So we'll let that grow until about emergence, and then we'll come in with, I think it was verdict and Roundup, and we terminate the cover crop at that time and leave some residual. But it's only about a week's worth of residual in that product at the rate we're using. Then we come in at just before V4 and we spray it again with just a straight Roundup, and sets us up for our interseeding, and we can interseed inside this with that thing. That's our whole herbicide program on the corn.
Here's the cowpea. Does very well in the shade, seems to be, and really good for the summer. It's a warm season. So we like using that one, and faba bean here right next to it. Kind of a sprawling plant we had basically given up on until the last couple of years. We decided to keep throwing it in because it actually did well. So flax is basically a staple. There's cereal rye, we got clover. This is a new one we've been trying, is chicory. Kind of expensive, but it's supposedly a great forage, so we'll find out. Seems to be doing pretty well in here. Is there lentil? Yeah. There's lentil and vetch. I don't know if I see any vetch right off the bat, but there's lentil there. There should be some buckwheat here somewhere. There's a buckwheat back here. There's rye. There's barley in here also. Here's a barley. There might be a Sudan grass there.
Is this actually something?
That's safflower right there.
Safflower.
Safflower, and I did find some Facilia. That's ragweed, that's not it. There's Facilia right there, which is mostly for pollinators.
So can you tell me what piece of equipment this is and why you chose to use it?
This is a piece of equipment we just built this last winter. It started out to be a Coulter style side dressing machine, 28%. But we bought it without the coulters, and we built some brackets and mounted some double disc openers on it. And then in the back we added a Valmar tank, so about 50 ton capacity seed. So we can go out and we can apply 28% nitrogen on our four sunflowers. At the same time, we can plant 2 rows of cover crop, that 10-inch spacing between our 30-inch corner sunflowers or soybeans. This machine is also set up for variable rate on the fertilizer side of it, so we can vary our nitrogen rates.
And how were you handling applying cover crops before you built this machine?
The first machine that we built before this one was just a simple 20-foot toolbar made from a cultivator, a row crop cultivator. Took the units off, put these Step-C units on it, and we got a little Gandhi box on it. And it was a very simple machine. It only cost us about $4,000 to put together, so it's economical. So we built that with the idea of learning if it was worthwhile. And by doing that, we really decided it was. This benefit of soil health plus the grazing aspect seemed to really pay off for us. So we thought we were justified in investing in this machine, which was considerably more than that, of course, to put together, but I think it will definitely pay for itself. Prior to interseeding, we tried some aerial application with cover crops, which was kind of a hit or miss. You know, if you got a good rain, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, or it fell in the cracks, and maybe they grew in the cracks. Or a lot of the seed would end up in the whorl on the corn, so it wasn't a real effective way to do it. So we switched to this method of seeding at about D4 to D5.
And do you see a big improvement with actually having the seed go into the ground versus broadcasting in germination rate?
By putting the seed directly in the ground, we can use a lot less seed and get a better stand. That's kind of what it comes down to. And we always have a stand that maybe isn't spectacular. The biggest limiting factor is probably how good the crop is. If the crop is excellent, the cover crop is more forward. If you have a thin spot in the field or on the headland where you turn around, cover crops really flourish in those spots. It always seems to do better than an aerial type crop.
And why did you decide to build something versus buy something?
We bought the machine the basic machine here we bought, but the openers we put together ourselves, and I guess the main reason is cost. There are openers designed for this purpose, but they're very expensive. We may update these at some point or something different, but they're working fairly well for now. We're doing some modifications on to try to get better seeds contacted. So you got some up here that have some drop chains on them. We were experimenting with that, and I think we're probably going to equip the machine with that to help cover the seed a little bit better.
Their perennial fescue is established after wheat in paired rows. The following spring, clover is seeded for additional feed quality and then grazed after the fescue has been harvested in late summer. This provides multiple revenue streams and multiple uses for the same field.
They were standing in a field of fescue, which is a perennial. We grow it as a turf grass. It's already been harvested. We'll graze this crop probably twice this fall. We won't just turn them out here hog wild. We will divide this off and graze it in sections at a time so we can get good utilization of everything and have good regrowth for the second time over. Standing in a field of Iowa, which is a polycrop. We're growing field peas instead of field pea. And we're growing Clearfield canola in the same field at the same time. The reason we have the Clearfield canola is we can use a herbicide called Beyond or Raptor. It's the same thing. We have some options for weed control. Use grass herbicides. One of the challenges this year with it being so wet, our peas don't like it wet. Like sun like that. So we have a little more stand issues and drought out spots in a lot of our peas. And with it being wet and not seeded, the canola kind of struggles to look at such a small seed. So that's one thing we gotta maybe tweak is try to figure out how to get the canola a little bit shallower with our seeding. So it's kind of, if you look across the field, it's kind of spotty where the canola is. You know, growing a polycrop like this, I mentioned the herbicide being a big issue, trying to find something that works on both. Another one is maturity. We're still trying to figure that out here. You can see the peas are very mature. They're actually ready to harvest. And a few of them are already starting to shell in certain places. Where this canola is not ready yet. We have to desiccate this crop to make it work. I would rather not have to do that, but I'm hoping that eventually we'll be able to either get a later pea or an earlier canola and try to match up that maturity a little better. But one of the benefits of living up where we do is we have a lot of market opportunity. So we have a place to deliver the peas just 20 miles away, and sunflowers 20 miles away, and the canola about 80 miles over. So we have a lot of different markets for different crops, so it gives us a good opportunity to have a lot of diversity in our rotation.
So this soil here is from our SHP plot, which is again new land that they've only had for 3 years.
and they're working on building the soil structure and aggregate stability of the soil. But we're going to be demonstrating it to another field that's been reduced till and no-till since 1994. And so you'll be able to see a really big difference in the soil structure between these two. And what you want to happen is eventually this soil acts like this soil. And we're going to let's do like this piece here. And then we'll do, I'm going to break it into about the same size pieces so that way it's a little bit more fair. And we'll see what happens, right?
Your hypothesis is clear.
I know, I'm a little nervous about that.
I'm always nervous.
All right, you ready? You recording?
Yes.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah, it's definitely different. That's crazy.
And so you can see here in this soil aggregate that it's falling apart significantly faster than this one, even though they were taken from the same spot in the soil profile. So that tells you that this soil has some work to do. There's some more aggregation that we can build in here, and this plot didn't even have a cover crop growing in it at the point that this one did. And so that tells you even the management strategies that you use plays a big impact on how your soil functions in the end. So I want to bring you back now that we've had some time to have these soil aggregates sit in the water. And as you can see, there's much more soil at the bottom here. And like I said, the ultimate goal is to get this soil to act like this one. And so that's what we're doing in our SHP plot. With the inclusion of cover crops, we're hoping that the cover crop strips will act more like this soil that's been no-tilled for the last 25 years, faster than if it was just reduced tillage by itself. And so that's something that we'll be checking the progress on over time of this trial. And so you can see, I mean, this is something very simple for you to set up and do at home. It took me 5 minutes. I had 2 jars of the same size, and I made these little wire baskets out of some chicken wire and shoved them in there and put the soil aggregates in at the same time. Let it rip, and this is what happens. And so I think that's really, really demonstrative for a lot of people, and I hope that, you know, it's really simple. You forget to do it, but go out and try it and see what happens. I think it'll tell you a lot. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope you learned something. I hope you think differently. I hope that you're thinking about what you can do next on your farm, and, you know, even if it's not to the degree that Trinity Creek is, or it's, you know, completely outside of your comfort zone, that you're just challenging yourself to do something new and try and become more profitable by changing up your management strategies. And so hopefully you learned a little bit about that today. Hopefully you learned a little bit about soil science and that you enjoyed it. And I thank you all for watching.
Welcome to...
All right. We're coming back here, and I really, really want to thank David, Ben, and Michaela for their for them showing us around their farm. And I think it's great that we can have such diversity both in our growers and in their rotations. Next, we will be coming in on our live Q&A, and so I'll be joined by Keith Byerly, our Kansas and Nebraska field manager, to co-host our Q&A session today. Joining us today to answer some of your questions will be David Miller, Michaela Talbert, Glenn Hjelle, and Justin Knopf. Unfortunately, Michael Jordan won't be able to make it today. And so I want to have all of our growers turn their screens back on. And Justin, I just want you to wave for a second if you can. When you get your video back, just so that everybody who wasn't at the Kansas videos yesterday can see you. But thank you everybody for joining us today and being flexible. I think we're going to start off with hopefully a simple question, but I think that one that is really helpful for a lot of people to hear, and that's knowing that it's impossible to put definition on the what's and whys of what you're doing on your farm to, you know, the perfect nth degree. But, you know, if you had to fill in the blank, what would be the single most important thing that you started your soil health journey? What did you originally, what started your soil health journey? What term would you say was the major piece for you? And I think we'll start with Trinity Creek, and then we'll go to Glenn, and then we'll go to Justin.
Well, I guess the main focus we had was I'm sorry, our power just went out and our computer's going nuts here.
All right, well, but
I might have to shut it down.
well, then why don't we switch to Glenn and put you guys on mute for a second, just to give you a chance to get all of that figured out. Glenn, go ahead.
The question was what got me started and why.
Yeah.
Biggest thing that got me is when we'd have open winters and watching the neighbors' fields and our fields at the time, the dirt started blowing away in the winter, and I noticed the fields that we were minimum tilling or having the cover crops were staying put. So I started doing more of that, because it's like when dirt blows in the wind, you're losing soil, and that's not good. There's your profit.
Yep, exactly. Justin?
Well, we're obviously always limited by water here in our climate. And so that was one big thing that got us started, is just realizing that if we changed our management practices to be able to more effectively capture and store water, the limited amount that we get, and make it available for when the crops need it, that would increase our success over time. So water was a really big factor. And then also just the trajectory that our soil resource was on, based on a tillage system that we were previously in years ago, and just realizing that that's a natural resource that we can't really readily replace. And so just changing the trajectory of not having it moving towards a degraded resource.
Absolutely. Michaela, are you ready to go, or should we keep moving on?
Okay, I think we're okay.
Struggles.
All right, we're working on a little phone here. It's all we got going here. But
Sure.
I guess the reason I got into changing things when I took over the operation is Glenn had mentioned blowing soil, and our soil is very light. And in the spring here with conventional tillage, you can have a windstorm that you can't see across the highway. So that was kind of the starting point. We just had to fix that it was just degrading our soil too much. So that began our journey.
Sure. I have a question here from Lauren. Hi, Lauren. It's good to hear from you. The main risk with cereal rye in a wheat rotation is only if you're growing seed wheat. Can we clarify why cereal rye is a risk to our wheat rotations? Maybe we can start with David and Michaela this time.
I guess it's more aesthetics more than anything. I guess they'll allow, I think it's 5% rye in your wheat before you get docked for it. So it isn't really an issue. It's more aesthetics probably than anything.
Sure. And Glenn, I know you talked about concerns with disease management. Is that correct?
Yeah, I worry about the green bridge, the same type of diseases are present in rye as in wheat and corn. So I try not to use that. And I didn't realize there was an issue with, putting wheat and having contamination. So we've never used rye. So.
Sure. Justin?
Well, we're not growing as much for seed right here, but there's certainly hesitation in Kansas and here where there's a lot of continuous wheat acres still that my neighbors utilize, and when they see us growing either rye or triticale as a cover, we try to be sensitive to that concern and try to make sure that we're terminating it before we have any viable seed set. We've worked on some seeding dates. We're trying to seed, usually our rye or triticale is ahead of soybeans, and we're trying to work on maturities to where we're seeding those soybeans green through that triticale or rye, but that's tricky because we don't also want viable seed set, because I have a lot of members of my community that get nervous when it starts heading out and flowering. So we're still kind of fine tuning that system.
Sure, and that can be challenging because everybody claims that rye, cereal rye is the best beginner cover crop, and so to be challenged in a wheat rotation, I think that it's important to bring it up.
And I also think, Justin, one of the things that we talked about yesterday was that the later head establishment on wheat versus that real early establishment on rye can be tricky when we have the longer growing seasons as we move south.
Yes, that's true. And then I think that maybe more importantly, the diversity of the rotation can really overcome any concerns. I've had, we all have things that don't go according to plan. In 2019, we had a horribly wet season, and I had a field of cover crop triticale that I just literally could not get in to spray out, and it all headed and went to seed, and which changed my plans and my rotation there. But I'm not that concerned about it because we have enough diversity in our rotation to where it's not going to create a problem. So I think the diversity can overcome most of those concerns.
I think that leads into another question we've got over here in the chat box, and that was that when you all are using multiple species on the farms, you have multiple crops in your rotation and in your cover crop mixes, how do you manage the rotation along with residual herbicides? And Glenn, why don't we start with you on this one?
I'm just putting my cover crops after wheat. I don't have a issue with the chemical carryover, but that's part of the reason why I haven't started putting in the cover crops in my soybeans or corn, because of the pre-plants, pre-emerged chemical I put down to control weeds. I don't think I could get a cover crop to establish.
Justin, I know Garrett talked a little bit about this with us yesterday. You want to touch some more on this?
Yeah, it's really thinking ahead. And even Garrett mentioned that yesterday is in our wheats, there's a lot of finesse and SU chemistries used in our geography. And so they have longer lasting residuals. So we've moved away from those. Luckily, we have some good choices that are still pretty effective and cost effective also, that don't carry as much residual. And so it's just really more a long-term thought process as we're planning that crop. We have to look more 12 and 18 months, sometimes 24 months into advance into what our plan would be, which doesn't always work out, obviously, but just more thinking ahead and thinking strategically about that. And I'm just incredibly inspired and fascinated by what you guys are doing up there at Trinity Creek and the interseeding, and that's a whole the way to manage weeds through competition and less through herbicide, I think is helps with that as well. And then if we're able to use less residual herbicides, then again, creates more opportunity for diversity and utilization of the covers.
David, Michaela, with your interseeding.
Okay, I agree with a lot what Justin said there, but we're very limited on what we can use for residuals. I guess starting in the wheat, we don't use like a wide match or something that would carry over like that. We're using pretty like an affinity and a 2,4-D mix, that something that won't last in the fall, so we get a good cover crop establishment. Critical to our operation is a good burn down. We're using Roundup and Sharpen pretty heavily in a lot of our situations where we can, or Roundup and AIM, but has very low residual. After that, we're really relying on residue and cereal rye to really help us. Most years that's worked pretty well. This year it's been much more challenging. We've got a lot of water continually raining, and we've got more weed pressure than we've had before, so we might have to get a little more aggressive. Another big concern of ours is we graze just about everything, so we have to look at the labels of every herbicide we use for grazing restrictions. So when you take and look at herbicide labels and compare grazing restrictions and rotational restrictions, your list of chemicals gets very short. So the big thing is relying on that residue and cover crops more than anything.
we had a comment during the answers there from Roger out in western Kansas, and Roger said that his experience has been his competition with his cover crops has more than offset the reduced chemical application, or reducing his chemical applications with the competition of the covers has proven to be especially profitable, and when he can add grazing to that, that adds to it even further. So I see we've got another question here from Steely. Have any of you been able to secure any premiums as of yet for crops grown using some of the soil health practices that we've discussed in the last couple of days? And along with that, what role do the in companies play in passing along that additional value that they're getting when they're selling it on the market back to you guys as the growers?
Unfortunately, nothing. It would be really nice if they would incentivize that. I think it would make it a lot easier for other people to jump in. I would say a lot of our soil health practices are helping us be more of a least cost producer as far as profitability goes. So we're not getting premiums, but I would say our chemical use is a lot lower, so that expense has gone down greatly. I would say the cover crop pays for that, and we've been scaling back our fertility. We're not quite sure where that actually should be, and maybe we scaled back too much this year. So that's kind of, once you get the system going, I think that's where the profitability can be. But as far as getting a premium, not really. We're moving into direct marketing our beef cattle now, since we have a small feedlot, and so maybe that helps our customers see that we're trying to be more environmental friendly, but we're not really getting a premium, I would say, except for what direct marketing would do.
Glenn, do you have any comments to add?
I would say, there's no premium in the end product, but the profitability is better because with the cover crops and reduced tillage, I can get my crops planted earlier. So you gain more yield by early planting, and I can also harvest when the neighbors are getting stuck in the mud because of the water infiltration. So that's where you gain the profitability.
Sure. And Justin, since I know that wheat quality is a really big thing for you, is that anything that you can tie into this conversation, or have you had interest in that realm?
We've had some interest in it, but cannot unfortunately say that I've fetched any extra value for some of the work that we're doing on paying more attention in quality. We've had some conversations about it, and I'm hopeful in time that may happen, but it's a big lift. You know, the commodity system is efficient, it's fast, it's made for handling bulk, and this is kind of disruptive to that type of a system. And you know, there's certainly inherent benefits and important things about the commodity system and how it works, and how companies like General Mills source their products from large grain sheds, but there's absolute limitations to it too, and it makes it challenging to bring that value back through the supply chain, when I believe many consumers have very sincere interest in supporting things that are great societal benefits, like cleaning up water and air and improving soils, and taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sinking it into soils. I think there's great interest in doing that. You know, and General Mills obviously is which I appreciate their support and what they're doing with SHP and through the Wheat Foundation in this. But at the same time, it frustrates me at points to walk on a farm like your all's or ours, and feel like a company is taking credit because they've trained us to do these things. You know, and education's important and valuable, but also I'm hopeful that in time, just like you guys mentioned up at Trinity Creek, I think the comment that if we really want adoption to scale at this, which I think is very feasible, if there is a better mechanism for those companies, if they truly want this to scale, I think they need to think a little bit more strategically about how to move that value and share some of that value, that societal benefit that we are creating here back from the consumer to the farmer, because I believe the consumers are interested in making that investment. Some of them are. I know that's a big ask and it's a little pie in the sky, but if, you know, I read some of the press releases and how much these companies are wanting to do on supporting these efforts, but sometimes it's a little disheartening to see that there's not as much, that's just not, the value doesn't go back to the farmer, at least not yet.
Sure. Are there any other comments on that question? Okay. I'm hoping that all of you listening right now gained some insights from yesterday and today, but I really also want to talk to all of you about some of the things moving forward and things that you might potentially be wanting to try in your farm next, because I know that that's always, you know, people who implement soil health are always thinking of the next step. And so I'm hoping that maybe you'd be willing to discuss some of those things. David and Michaela, would you maybe talk on that a little bit?
This year, I think we're seeing some challenges that have been kind of unique. Michaela talked about fertility and chemical costs, and we have scaled back considerably on those, and we've used like the Haney test and the soil test to try to guide those decisions. But it's a real difficult thing to do and see your yields not what you're expecting maybe, but we have to look at profitability is the main thing, of course. But I think our focus in the next couple of years is going to be finding that balance of what fertility we need, what we can expect from the improved soil health, and what we still need to supplement, and how to keep the weeds under control. We're dealing with a lot of water hemp and resistant ragweed here now, and hopefully not Palmer, but we could get that too. So we have to deal with those issues and still try to make the soil health thing work, and deal with not being able to have the heavy residual chemicals. So a lot of challenges there. I think that's going to be our biggest challenge in the next couple of years, is finding that happy balance, and hopefully waiting for the soil health to kind of build and meet some of those goals.
Sure. Justin, would you care to comment?
Yeah, we're trying to, I just can't help but say how much I enjoyed David and Michaela's segment there, but we're trying to integrate livestock a little bit more into our cropping system through a grazing phase, and also just this week, actually, or last week, seeded a perennial mix to try to take a perennial break on some from our annual system that would be mostly designed for possibly haying, but more hopefully grazing. And then I really would like to figure out how to interseed. And you know, we're a little bit drier climate, and I appreciate the comments that you guys had about getting that seed into the soil and getting a better establishment. And that's some things we're trying to figure out, how to get our winter cereal covers seeded before grain sorghum harvest, and trying to do some of those things to where those roots are actually overlapping, instead of right now we're doing more of a harvest and then immediately seeding, and I'd rather be able to have those plants coming up through that canopy like you guys are doing up there. And so those are the next steps for us to try to figure out. We're looking at phosphorus a little bit too, as our mycorrhizal content increases. You know, there's a lot of good indications and thought to where maybe we don't need as much a high part per million p-test as what we historically have thought. So we're looking at that some as well from the fertility standpoint.
Sure. Glenn, what about you?
Oh, my difficulties here is that, like, I would like to interseed into the corn and soybeans also, but we don't have cattle, so it's hard to justify how to make it pay without grazing. I'm still doing it even without the cattle, because I do feel the fertility and the water infiltration is benefiting me enough to justify the extra expense. And for me, the big issue too is the chemical resistant weeds, the water hemps, the palmer amaranths, the ragweeds, and if I could get a cover crop established enough to choke them out without having to use chemical would be a big benefit. So getting an interseeder set up somehow would be the next step for me.
And I think the last question I'd like to ask everybody is just, what are you using, either software or manage strategies, to keep track of your rotation, the herbicide that you're using, and how you're balancing all of these pieces? You know, there's a lot of moving parts going on in these farms. And so I think having a system to help balance all of that, if you have one, I would love to hear about it. And Glenn, I think maybe we'll start with you and then move on to Trinity Creek Ranch.
I guess as far as herbicide records, I keep all them records, but I hire Central and they have to do a good job of keeping a history of soil tests and my rotation. So I kind of rely on them a lot. Other than having a special program, I don't really have that. You know, I've got climate that helps track yields over the years for different fields.
Sure. Are you having struggles over there, Michaela and David?
My computer's back up.
We're working on coming back. Are we here?
I think we're here. Are we both places? I don't know where we are.
I use Centerpoint Accounting for Agriculture, and it's a pretty complicated accounting program. Are we actually here?
On the computer now.
You just got to mute yourself on the other one.
Power went out like just about. Power went out just about when the Q&A started. So yeah, I use Centerpoint. I do a lot of Excel spreadsheets, but truthfully, we've got so much paper data of old stuff. It's ridiculous that I've been trying to digitalize that, but I don't know. It's a lot of, yeah, we try to track everything. We're working on getting a little more.
We use Centerpoint for agriculture as far as accounting goes, and it's just a lot of Excel spreadsheets. Yeah, a lot of different computer, software we're using.
But we track profitability per field, so like everything through Centerpoint they allow you to do per field. So we can watch that. We definitely the long-term no-till that is our owned land is always way more profitable than the rented land, even without the rent included.
Sure. Justin?
Yeah, not one of my big strengths here, but I'm using mostly Excel spreadsheets, particularly with our crop rotation. We have one that I've been utilizing. Actually, it goes all the way back to when I first came back to farm in 2003, and has tracked our rotation on those fields since then, as well as a separate spreadsheet that's tracking yields in each field across time. It's getting a little bit more, the simplicity of that spreadsheet is starting to become a limitation when we're now with these more complex cover crop mixes. So I don't have a good answer for that piece yet, but having that spreadsheet, because the really important part is the forward-looking part of it for me increasingly, and so being able to look out for several years on what that rotation will be per field is very important and helpful in thinking through where covers fit within that cropping rotation on each of those fields, and then thinking through that herbicide program looking ahead is, as we discussed a bit ago, is really important.
Sure. Yeah, I think that if some companies could magically incorporate all of these soil health practices into their programs, I think that would make everybody's life easier, but we've got to let it catch up. But I really want to thank all of you today for coming and speaking with us. I really appreciate your comments, and glad that you could make it and hopefully provide some wisdom and insight for the people that are listening today. So if those who are listening, you can go to soilhealthpartnership.org to locate your local field manager. We are in most of the states in the Midwest. And you can connect with us on social media and find upcoming webinars and listen to our podcast, read our latest blogs. So I hope you enjoyed today and the last couple of days, and I thank you for joining us.